She had spent her whole life scrubbing their floors, but nothing broke her heart more than watching her son humiliated in front of the men she served. That night, Omar al-Rashid sneered at a maid's child, spitting words so cruel they left her trembling. What he didn't know was that the boy he called worthless was about to bring his empire crashing. Down. Get this trash out of here before he embarrasses us all. Omar al-Rashid's voice cut through the air like a whip, each word laced with contempt. His gold watch caught the chandelier's light as his hand shoved the boy aside, sending the cleaning supplies clattering across the polished marble floor. Gasps rippled through the grand conference room, though most quickly dissolved into awkward laughter. A few men in expensive suits pulled out their phones, recording with smirks, eager to capture the spectacle. The moment was cruel, yet in that world of power and money, cruelty was often mistaken for strength. The setting was a palace of wealth disguised as a business hall. High ceilings, velvet curtains, a table large enough to seat kings. At its center, documents worth $500 million lay waiting for signatures that would decide the future of entire communities. American executives sat stiff in tailored suits, surrounded by Omar's entourage of polished advisors and smug investors. The atmosphere was thick with confidence, pride, and greed. No one expected the quiet shadow that slipped between their world and theirs. The maid's son, Yusuf, was just 12. Barefoot in shoes too worn to be called shoes, he carried his mother's cleaning cart with the practiced silence of a child who had learned how to disappear. His black hair fell into eyes sharper than anyone noticed, eyes that lingered on every corner, every word, every gesture. To most, he was invisible, an object in the background like the vases or chandeliers. To Omar, he was something worse, a reminder that poverty dared to exist in the same room as power. When Yusuf stumbled forward, the cart's wheel catching on the edge of a rug, Omar's fury ignited. His shove was not just meant to move the boy, it was meant to humiliate, to remind everyone present who belonged and who didn't. The room's response was a chorus of awkwardness. Some chuckled nervously, eyes darting to Omar for approval. Others shook their heads, whispering about how the boy shouldn't have been there in the first place. Phones tilted upward, red dots glowing, eager to immortalize Yusuf's disgrace. But Yusuf did not cry. He did not shout. His small hands gathered the scattered supplies quietly, stacking bottles of polish and folded cloths with care, as though no insult had touched him. His face remained calm, though his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, burned with something unspoken. He was not trash. He was not what Omar thought. The laughter in the room swelled, carrying with it the smugness of men who believed they knew the end of this story. They thought they were watching a boy being crushed, unaware that the crushing was only beginning, and not for him. The narrator's voice lingered, quiet yet cutting like a whisper before a storm. They thought it was harmless mockery, but within moments their laughter would turn into stunned silence. Yusuf's world was not marble halls or glittering chandeliers. His world was the narrow servants' corridor behind them, where the scent of bleach clung to the walls and silence was survival. His mother, Amara, had spent the better part of her life scrubbing the floors of people who would never remember her name. Day after day, she bent her back to polish what others dirtied, her hands cracked and raw, her pay barely enough to keep food on their small table. Nights were no kinder. When she finally returned home, exhaustion pulled at her every step, but she never allowed despair to take her voice. For Yusuf, her strength was the most powerful lesson of all. In the dim glow of streetlights outside their tiny apartment, Yusuf created a secret world of his own. While other boys his age played football in alleys, he hunched over torn books salvaged from trash bins behind hotels. A frayed grammar guide here, a scribbled notebook there, pieces of knowledge that others discarded became his treasure. When electricity failed, which it often did, the faint orange pools of streetlight became his classroom. By day, he pushed his mother's cleaning cart, silent, invisible. By night, he devoured languages, syllable by syllable, sentence by sentence. From broken English CDs to Arabic news clips online, even videos in French and Spanish, each became a weapon he forged in silence. His mother's voice carried him through those long nights. Son, respect is not given, it is earned. and once earned, no one can take it away. She told him this whenever the world tried to crush them, whenever Omar's guards barked insults or rich guests sneered at their patched clothes. Amara had no wealth to pass on, no land, no heirlooms. But she had dignity, carved out of struggle, and she placed it in Yusuf's hands as though it were gold, and Yusuf held it close. His dream was not to clean the halls of men like Omar forever. He dreamed of courtrooms, of standing tall in black robes, armed with the law as his shield. He dreamed of defending people like his mother, people exploited, ignored, or silenced. In his mind, he argued cases late into the night, his young voice echoing across imaginary chambers, proving wrong the ones who had laughed at him. He would not remain invisible. He would rise where no one expected him to. But the world of Omar al-Rashid was built to silence boys like Yusuf. Omar was the embodiment of oil-soaked wealth, a billionaire born into riches so vast he never learned the meaning of limits. To him, money was not just power, it was proof that he was above the rest. His fleet of cars, his private jets, his estates spread across continents were not luxuries. They were weapons. He wielded them to remind the world of his dominance. And nothing amused him more than belittling those beneath him. In his eyes, the poor existed for his convenience. Maids to clean his messes, waiters to serve his banquets, children to be trampled under his polished shoes. He had an obsession with appearances, his suits tailored to perfection, his manner sharp with arrogance. And behind closed doors, he boasted of his brilliance, convinced that the Americans he dealt with were nothing more than greedy fools, desperate for his approval. To Omar, every handshake was a performance, every deal a trap designed to bleed the other party dry. On that day, as the $500 million deal neared its climax, Omar was at the height of his confidence. Surrounded by advisors who nodded at every word, investors who laughed at every joke, he wore his arrogance like a crown. To him, Yusuf was no more than a fly buzzing too close to his feast. What he failed to see was the quiet storm gathering in that child's sharp eyes. The boy who bent over torn books at night. The boy who absorbed languages whispered through glowing screens. The boy who carried his mother's lessons like armor. He was watching. He was listening. And though Omar thought his Arabic insults were a shield of secrecy, Yusuf understood every word. The narrator's voice whispered through the memory, steady as a drumbeat. Dignity doesn't shout. It waits. Then it roars. The conference room hummed with the weight of power, the scent of expensive cologne mingling with the crisp rustle of contracts being laid out. Men in suits shifted in their seats, eager to seal a $500 million deal. At the head of the table sat Omar al-Rashid, basking in his own grandeur like a king on his throne. He tapped his pen against the table, glancing toward the corner where Yusuf stood silently beside his mother's cleaning cart. "Look at him," Omar sneered, his words laced with venom. "Even the janitor brings his brat to watch greatness. Tell me, boy, do you polish the floor with the same hands you eat with? Or do you let your mother lick it clean for me?" Laughter erupted, loud and ugly, bouncing off the marble walls. Several investors slapped the table, their chuckles echoing like applause. Others, however, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their smiles faltering. Yusuf did not flinch. He lowered his gaze, gathering a stray rag that had slipped from the cart. His hands moved with quiet precision, as though the mockery had no place in his world. But behind his stillness his eyes flickered, absorbing, analyzing, memorizing every word. Omar wasn't finished. "You see, gentlemen," he said, raising his glass of water, "this is what separates men like us from the insects crawling at our feet. They exist to remind us of our place at the top." He tilted his glass toward Yusuf, mockingly offering a toast. "To garbage. May it never forget it is garbage." Half the room roared with laughter, the kind that came not from humor, but from obedience. They laughed because Omar laughed. They laughed because power demanded it. But scattered among them were faces that betrayed discomfort. A young American advisor frowning at his notepad, an older European investor whose lips tightened at the cruelty. Yet none spoke. Silence was safer. Yusuf bent to wipe a smear from the cart's handle, his movements calm, deliberate. His silence was not a weakness. It was armor. Each insult Omar hurled only sharpened the edge of Yusuf's resolve. He thought of his mother's voice echoing in his mind. Respect is not given, it is earned. He would not hand Omar the satisfaction of a reaction. "Come closer, boy," Omar called, waving a jeweled hand. "Don't hide in the shadows. Show our guests the face of poverty. Gentlemen, I present to you the future of failure, too poor for school, too useless for anything but cleaning toilets." His entourage laughed again, some louder than before, their voices brittle with forced amusement. Yusuf stepped forward quietly, his small frame dwarfed by the towering men around the table. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The stillness of his presence unsettled some, though Omar mistook it for submission. One American executive leaned toward another and whispered, not realizing Yusuf's sharp ears caught every word. "Why is he doing this? It's distasteful." "Because he can," the other replied with a shrug. Omar's voice rose, intoxicated by his own cruelty. "You know what amuses me most? The poor always believe they have dignity, but dignity doesn't feed you. Dignity doesn't buy you cars or skyscrapers or power. Dignity is a bedtime story the weak tell themselves." He leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Isn't that right, boy?" For the first time, Yusuf lifted his gaze. His dark eyes locked on Omar's with a steady calmness that made the billionaire pause, just for a breath. The room noticed. Something stirred in the silence that followed, something unspoken. A guest shifted uneasily. Another cleared his throat. Omar laughed it off, but his chuckle carried a nervous edge. "See? Even the child knows when to bow his head." The laughter this time was weaker. A few men chuckled half-heartedly, but others remained quiet. One guest, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Careful, sometimes the quiet ones surprise you." Yusuf returned his gaze to the floor, but the seed had been planted. His silence was no longer seen as submission. It was beginning to look like patience. The insults continued. Omar called him a shadow, a parasite, a blemish on the room's luxury. He mocked Amara, sneering at the idea that a maid's family could dream of anything greater. Each word dripped with arrogance, each insult another attempt to crush a boy who refused to break. And yet, the more Yusuf absorbed, the more the balance of the room began to shift. Laughter grew strained. Investors glanced at one another with doubt. Omar, blinded by his own arrogance, never noticed. But Yusuf noticed everything. He catalogued the clauses Omar boasted about in Arabic, the sly phrases he used to manipulate the Americans. He listened. He learned. He prepared. By the time the contracts were laid out and pens poised to sign, the room was divided. Half still grinned at Omar's cruelty, eager for profit. The other half sat in uneasy silence, sensing that something was brewing beneath the stillness of a child who had not uttered a single word. And Yusuf, standing by his mother's cart, eyes burning with quiet fire, knew the moment of roaring was close. The contracts lay open like treasure maps across the polished table, pens poised above them, the weight of $500 million pressing down on every man in the room. Omar leaned back in his chair, smugness dripping from his every gesture. His eyes flicked to the Americans, hungry, eager, oblivious, and then he leaned toward his advisors, lowering his voice into the velvet smoothness of Arabic. "In 30 days, he whispered, lips curling, "the Americans will hand me everything. Their penalty is $200 million if they even think of pulling out. And when I take control, the poor neighborhoods will be demolished, bulldozed to the ground. Their homes will fall like dust, and I will build towers where their families once slept." A ripple of laughter spread among his men, low and confident. The Americans, unable to follow the language, smiled politely, believing themselves moments away from profit. Omar glanced toward Yusuf, standing silent beside his mother's cart. His smirk deepened. He called the boy trash, but tonight he also made him his unwilling audience. But then, Yusuf moved. The boy stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air with clarity beyond his years. In Arabic first, word for word. "In 30 days, the Americans will hand me everything. Their penalty is $200 million, and the poor will lose their homes." Then, in perfect English, "That is what he just said." The room froze. Gasps cracked through the silence like glass shattering. Heads whipped toward the boy. Phones lifted higher, their cameras capturing every detail. Omar's smile faltered, confusion flashing into anger. His advisors stiffened, eyes darting to one another in alarm. Lies! Omar roared, slamming his fist on the table. The boy doesn't know a single word. But Yusuf's gaze didn't waver. He stepped closer to the table, his small hand resting on the open contract. His voice was steady, deliberate. Test me. Give me the contract. David Harrison, the American executive, blinked in shock. For a moment he hesitated, caught between disbelief and the strange, unshakable certainty in the boy's eyes. Finally, he pushed the thick Arabic contract across the table. Translate, he demanded. Yusuf bent over the pages, scanning the ornate script with the speed of a boy who had trained in secret for years. His finger traced a line. Here, page 6, clause 22. It states that after 30 days, operational control passes entirely to Omar al-Rashid, regardless of previous terms. Page 9, clause 34. A penalty of $200 million for the Americans if they attempt withdrawal, no matter the reason. Page 14. His voice trembled only for a heartbeat before steadying again. It details eviction rights, granting Omar authority to demolish existing housing developments and displace entire communities without compensation. Murmurs swept through the Americans, their faces hardening as the truth unfolded. Omar's complexion shifted from arrogance to fury, his mask slipping with every word the boy spoke. Enough, Omar barked, rising to his feet. He is a child, a thief, a liar. David Harrison's voice cut across the chaos like steel. Then let us make it simple. You will speak, Mr. al-Rashid, and this boy will translate live for all of us. The challenge silenced the room. Cameras tilted forward. Advisors froze. Omar's jaw clenched, but pride forced him to accept. He straightened his suit and sneered. Fine, let the brat try. He began in Arabic, his voice dripping venom. I will not be insulted by a maid's child in front of men who matter. And Yusuf, eyes locked on Omar, translated with crisp precision. He says he refuses to be insulted by a maid's child in front of men who matter. The room gasped. Omar tried again, faster this time, spitting words meant to twist and distract. Yusuf matched him line for line, never faltering, his young voice echoing like a weapon, revealing every insult, every deception, every hidden trap. Each phrase struck the Americans like a dagger, exposing how close they had come to ruin. Omar's fury mounted, his words unraveling into threats and curses. Still, Yusuf stood firm, each translation steady, undeniable. His silence had finally roared, and then came the moment. Yusuf straightened, his small frame carrying the weight of 1,000 truths. He looked Omar dead in the eye, his voice ringing out across the room. Respect is the only universal currency. And today, you are bankrupt. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. For the first time, Omar's power cracked. His face twisted, but the room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the boy he had called trash. David Harrison rose, lifting his phone high. We have recordings, he announced. Every insult, every boast, every threat, documented. This deal is finished. And Omar al-Rashid is exposed. The eruption was instant. Voices clashed. Phones buzzed with calls. Cameras flashed. Security stormed in, and within minutes, Omar was restrained, his shouts drowned by the chaos. Investors turned their backs. Americans shook Yusuf's hand. And Amara, standing frozen at the edge of the room, pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. As Omar was dragged away, humiliated, Yusuf stood tall, not as the maid's son, not as a shadow, but as the voice that had brought an empire of lies crashing down. The silence after Omar was dragged from the room felt heavier than any words. For a moment, no one moved. Papers lay scattered across the polished table, pens abandoned mid-signature, and the once celebratory atmosphere had curdled into disbelief. The $500 million deal, minutes from being sealed, now lay in ruins, exposed for the fraud it truly was. One by one, the investors began to rise. Some muttered under their breath, faces red with humiliation. Others stormed out without so much as a handshake. their expensive shoes echoing sharply across the marble floor. Their loyalty to Omar evaporated the instant his lies were revealed. To be seen standing beside him now was poison, and they fled as if their reputations depended on it. Because they did. David Harrison remained seated for a moment, his eyes fixed on Yusuf. In the chaos of betrayal, the boy's calm composure stood out like a lighthouse in the storm. Finally, David rose, straightening his suit with deliberate care. He walked around the table, ignoring the abandoned contracts, until he stood before Yusuf. The boy, still gripping the edge of his mother's cleaning cart, looked up at the towering man with steady eyes. David's voice carried across the hushed room. This young man has done what an army of lawyers and translators could not. He has protected not just this company, but the lives of families who would have been destroyed by Omar's greed. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he turned to the remaining executives. I declare him an official youth consultant on our international contracts. Effective immediately. Applause thundered through the hall. It began hesitantly, a few claps from the Americans, then swelled into a roar as others joined, the sound shaking the very chandeliers. Phones swung toward Yusuf, recording every second. What had started as a humiliation was now a coronation. Amara, standing frozen at the back of the room, pressed both hands to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Her son, the boy mocked as trash, the boy who studied under streetlights, was being applauded by the wealthiest men in the room. She moved forward, her steps trembling. When she reached him, she cupped his face in her hands. Her voice cracked as she whispered, loud enough for all to hear, "You didn't just protect them, son. You made them listen." Yusuf's composure finally broke. He blinked hard, fighting back tears, but the strength in his eyes only grew. He hugged his mother tightly, the cart of cleaning supplies between them, a symbol of where they came from and what they had just risen above. Meanwhile, the media storm ignited. Cameras flashed, reporters shoved microphones forward, and within minutes the story had escaped the four walls of that room. Breaking news alerts blazed across screens. 12-year-old Maid's son stops 500 matras. Fraud. Boy exposes Billionaire's Arabic trap. Deal collapses in minutes. David Harrison saved by child translator. Clips of Yusuf's translation spread like wildfire online. His words, "Respect is the only universal currency," and "Today, you are bankrupt," were replayed on loop, turned into headlines, hashtags, and even memes. The boy who was invisible minutes earlier was now the most visible person in the world. Omar, once untouchable, became a cautionary tale overnight. Images of him being dragged from the hall circulated globally, his furious shouts subtitled and mocked. His empire, once gilded with arrogance, began to crumble under the weight of scandal. But in that moment, Yusuf cared little for the world outside. All that mattered was his mother's embrace, her pride heavy in her tears. He had carried her lessons into the lion's den, and he had emerged not just unbroken, but triumphant. The hall was no longer a place of power reserved for the elite. For the first time, it belonged to a maid's son, who had spoken truth so boldly that even billions could not silence him. In the weeks that followed, Yusuf's life transformed in ways no one could have imagined. He returned to the same narrow apartment, the same flickering lights, the same cracked walls. But the boy who once studied under the dim glow of street lamps was no longer invisible. The world had seen him, and more importantly, the world had listened. Donations poured in from across the globe, strangers inspired by the maid's son who had dismantled a $500 million trap with nothing but his knowledge and courage. Yusuf didn't keep the wealth for himself. Instead, with his mother's guidance, he founded a scholarship program dedicated to children like him, children who cleaned hotel floors by day and dreamed of classrooms by night. He called it the Roar Foundation, named after his mother's mantra, "Dignity doesn't shout. It waits, then it roars." The foundation grew quickly. Schools reached out to partners, universities pledged support, and within months, dozens of underprivileged students were given access to education that had once been beyond reach. Yusuf, at just 12 years old, became a global symbol of brilliance hidden in poverty, proof that genius often blooms where society least expects it. Meanwhile, Omar al-Rashid's empire collapsed like a sandcastle under a rising tide. Arrest warrants were issued across multiple countries as evidence of fraud surfaced. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized, and his closest allies deserted him. Once a titan of wealth, he now found himself trapped in the same system he had manipulated, stripped of his power and influence. His name became synonymous with arrogance and greed, a cautionary tale taught in business schools and whispered in boardrooms. Remember Omar, wealth without integrity is ruin. But Yusuf's victory was not just personal, it was institutional. David Harrison, shaken by how close he and his board had come to catastrophe, launched a bold reform within his company. It was called the Hidden Talents Initiative, a program designed to identify and nurture gifted individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. Youth from refugee camps, inner-city schools, and struggling villages were invited to apply, given mentorship, internships, and scholarships. Yusuf's story became the blueprint, proving that brilliance could come from anywhere if given a chance to shine. The world couldn't stop talking about it. Clips of Yusuf translating Omar's words continued to circulate online. His calm defiance replayed millions of times. Hashtags surged. Maid son hero, respect is currency, the Roar Foundation. Artists painted murals of Yusuf in cities from Cairo to New York. Journalists called him the boy who rewrote the rules of power. His symbolic line, respect is the only universal currency, and today you are bankrupt, was quoted in classrooms, conferences, and parliaments. For Yusuf, the fame was overwhelming, but he carried it with the same quiet dignity he had shown in that marble hall. When asked in interviews what he wanted most, he always gave the same answer: for no child to feel invisible, for no mother to be mocked for her work. His words resonated far beyond the headlines. In a world obsessed with wealth and status, Yusuf had reminded humanity of something far greater: the unshakable value of respect, the unstoppable power of truth, and the hidden brilliance waiting in those societies. The Maid's son had not just stopped a $500 million fraud. He had sparked a movement. They mocked the Maid's son, forgetting dignity isn't stitched in a suit or sealed in a contract. They thought power lived only in marble halls and million-dollar signatures. Yet, in one night, their empire of lies collapsed, while truth rose from the most unexpected voice. A boy they called Trash stood taller than billionaires, armed not with wealth or influence but with knowledge, courage, and the dignity his mother had planted in him. The lesson is timeless and unshakable. Intelligence does not belong to privilege. Brilliance is not reserved for those born into luxury. True worth often lies in the overlooked, in the quiet children who study by candlelight, in the workers who are dismissed as invisible, in the voices silenced by arrogance. Yusuf proved that courage can shatter the walls built by greed, and that one act of truth can stop $500 million of corruption in its tracks. Remember this: the world is full of hidden talents waiting for a moment to roar. It might be the boy sweeping the floor, the girl balancing 3 jobs to finish school, or the neighbor no one notices. Their silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes silence is just preparation for the moment when the roar cannot be ignored. So, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were in that room when Yusuf exposed the $500 million trap? Would you have laughed with the crowd, or stood beside the boy who changed everything with a single truth? If this story moved you, comment below with your answer, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. Because every hidden talent deserves a chance to roar, and sometimes the loudest truths come from the quietest voices.